I really didn't plan on making another Norwich Hospital movie. That all changed on April 23rd, 2022. I decided to, after many, many years, to look at my old room at the employees' residence they called Pondview. This used to be my room. Look what they did to me. Confirmed murders. Yeah, okay. Yeah, you sad. I have a lot of good memories of this place. A lot of good times. I was a little upset about what I saw, and one of the first things I did was give my old friend Christine a call.
Now, here's Stu Breyer.
Morning, everybody. I've been looking forward to this hour. Christine, and you've got some books on the subject, so obviously you've done a lot of research.
I've invested over a decade into studying the history of the Norwich State Hospital and finding out what I can, because when I began my research over 10 years ago, there was very little information out there, and what was on the internet was grossly inaccurate and mostly loaded with ghost stories and false stories of hauntings.
About 2 weeks after I went to Pondview, there was an article in the New London Day, a very nice interview with Christine about Norwich Hospital, and somebody commented on the article, made some disparaging remark about Norwich Hospital, and I wrote my own comment to defend the old hospital, and the next person who wrote, Steve, you can't put a dress on that pig. And I kind of thought about it. I said, well, no, you can't, but lipstick on a pig. That'd be a good title for a film.
Good morning. It's 59 degrees at 8 o'clock. I'm Johnny London with today's lead story. The Norwich Hospital is officially closing its doors on this October the 10th after 92 years of service of caring for the mentally ill since 1904. The Norwich Hospital opened on the current campus on land along the east side of the Thames River, known as Brewster's Neck. The Norwich Hospital housed...
Back 20 years ago, I made this film called Brewster's Neck, Memories of Norwich State Hospital. And a few years later, made another one called Last Day in Norwich Hospital. And it was around this time that I met Christine. She was working on researching her first book, and she contacted me for more information on the hospital. It was through Christine I met Kevin Thibodeau. Kevin had access to the grounds for historical research for a period of about 10 years.
So Christine and I met, oh my God, has to be going on over 10 years now. And somehow we connected through my research for the state hospital and trying to figure out every little detail I could, no matter how big or small or what it entailed. And I think she was looking for more or less the same kind of information, and we just crossed paths. And literally to this day, every single day, we message each other with a little tidbit about Norwich or something all these years later, and it never gets old. I look forward to the messages every day.
So the three of us decided to look into the senseless vandalism that was happening on the grounds of the hospital. Our biggest concern was the beautiful administration building, because that building was the only building slated to be saved.
So the first time I went in there, it really takes your breath away. As you walk in, you see the grand marble staircase, and you see all the intricate woodwork and You go up the top of the stairs and there's just these windows with the light coming through. It really stops you in your tracks and you try and take it all in. And you see it now and everything's broken and destroyed and has paint all over it. The staircase is in pieces. There's not much left. It's mostly a frame. And it's really sad. I mean, sad isn't even strong enough of a word. It breaks your heart, really. And I can imagine for people who have more of a connection than I do that work there, to see that and then see it now, I can understand how sad and frustrating it is.
At first, we thought the town of Preston was to blame for not securing the building. However, we came to conclude there was really not much Preston could do.
So Preston, the Riverwalk Agency, they had the best intentions, I think, to protect the admin building because it's the only building slated for rehabilitation. So I honestly think their hearts were in the right place. There was a fireplace upstairs in the Board of Trustees room with the great tree on it and the Connecticut symbol, and it was really something to see. And they took it apart piece by piece, labeled it, and we were told it went to another property off-site to be preserved. We found out that wasn't the case. The blocks were hidden in the admin building, which in theory, they tried to close all the doors, they tried to block all the tunnels, but everybody getting into these buildings to explore, and once one door is opened, it's opened forever. And then everybody got in and thought it'd be a great idea to destroy everything there. And from what I understand, they get so much money allotted at a time to close everything up, to weather seal it and security and whatnot for the building. But as much as they do, the next day somebody's there ripping it open, ripping the plywood off, kicking a door in. And so these blocks from the fireplace are now all destroyed. And it's not their fault. Preston did what they could, but it's a never-ending battle, and you're going up against a lot of people.
Shortly after my visit to Pondview, I received an email from a show called Destination Fear. They wanted to know if I could be interviewed for their show. They said they'd be filming on the north side of the property. Unlike the Preston side, it had been left abandoned and in ruins by its owner. By going on the show, I figured I could find out more about what was happening on the north side of the property. So I agreed to be interviewed in the basement of the employees' residence where I used to live. Now, I knew full well that they were going to take my interview and edit it and use my words to fit their narrative. And it soon became apparent what their narrative was. And there was one thing they advertised that got Christine pretty upset.
This really got me very angry. They advertised and put, it was in one of their posts on their Facebook page, Norwich State Hospital was responsible for 559 forced sterilizations. As a historian, that caught my attention, and that made me say, okay, where did you get this information? I want to know. I'm going to start doing some digging. So I did some digging, and I found that as of 1965, only 557 sterilizations were performed on patients in the state of Connecticut, and not all of them were at Norwich State Hospital. In my research of what I found, as of 1925, the policies on sterilizations in the state of Connecticut indicated that Norwich State Hospital was no longer partaking in this procedure. I also found that out of this cumulative 557, Concrete Record has 27 sterilizations.
So the Destination Fear project, I think, was to gain the attention for afterwards, which was paranormal tours, and they were going to take that money from what they were charging people to overnight or photo sessions during the day and start rehabbing the building. This is what I was told. More of along the lines of Waverly Hills. They have people hunt for paranormal stuff, and then they take that money and put new windows, new roof, and they're trying to make it into a museum of sorts of the past of that specific property. I think that's was the intentions here, but I just don't know how far along it got before there was roadblocks met or what have you.
I don't know if their plans to turn Lippitt into a haunted museum will ever happen. I do know that just about every week I look on the internet and on YouTube, and there seems to be another haunted video from the Norwich side. And then there's a lot of stuff that's just plain stupid. This got me thinking about why people think Norwich Hospital is haunted in the first place. An article from Psychology Today led me to a book, Nightmare Factories, The Asylum in the American Imagination, by Troy Rondinone, PhD. Dr. Rondinone's book describes how novels, films, and the media have shaped American view of the mental hospital. Dr. Rondinone also described the concept of ruin pornography and how it applies to haunted attractions and videos.
Just look at the phrase ruin porn means you're getting a kind of a sense of excitement from the disaster, right? So you're looking at a place that might have a very tragic story and will look very bad. And this is sexy and alluring and very compelling and kind of a lurid. It has kind of a lurid attraction. People kind of project a sense of excitement into the very kind of sad story. You're turning people's lives who truly might have suffered from severe mental illness, and you're kind of turning their lives into theater.
After reading Troy's book, it got me thinking about a guy who grew up in Norwich, not far from where I lived. He started teaching English at the Norwich Free Academy when I was a freshman. He later made quite a name for himself writing fiction about mental illness. As far as I knew, Wally had no direct connection to the hospital. I was wrong.
I have a sort of relationship with the hospital from when I was a kid. Growing up in Norwich, of course, you were always aware that the hospital was there up at the top of Laurel Hill. You hear in the culture about, and that was even the case back, many years ago when I was a kid. You hear about, people with mental illness are, they're dangerous. I didn't know that I had any personal connection to the hospital until I think I was about maybe 14 or 15 years old. And my grandfather on my mother's side, I never knew him. And I was told by my mother that he had died before I was born. And I was born in 1950. And then when I was about 14 or 15, I heard from a cousin of mine. I think we were at a family wake or something. And she said, Papa was at the state hospital. And so I asked my father. My mother didn't want to talk about it, but I asked my father about it, and he said, yeah, he died in I think it was 1954, which I would have been about 3 years old at the time. So he had not, as my mother had said, died before I was born. But that was convenient if you didn't want to talk about him. But in his later years, and this would have been somewhere around 1945 or so, he began to act oddly. He didn't seem to be himself. He was angry a lot and would sort of go around the house mumbling. And anyway, on this one particular afternoon, he took a knife to my grandmother, and he left her on the kitchen floor, bleeding out, and he walked down to the police station in Norwich. What were they going to do with this guy? Were they going to, arrest him and send him to prison, or were they going to have him admitted to the state hospital? They figured it was a much better situation for him to be, declared somehow mentally incapacitated. I said to myself, I've been fascinated with the hospital all my life. And at this point, I'm like maybe 45 or so, if I remember correctly. And I said, but I've never actually walked the grounds. So I got permission to do that. I walked from building to building until I found the forensic building. And I knew that that's where my grandfather had been housed for all those years. And I just stood there looking at it, and and tears came to my eyes, and I just started crying. And then I went home, and over the next couple of years, I wrote the story within the story. And I know this much is true, which is about the Italian immigrant grandparents of the twins, particularly the grandfather. And I never have written anything so quickly as I did when I was writing. The pen was flying off the page, and believe me, that doesn't usually happen. So when I got all through with that, not knowing if it fit the novel or not, I realized that what I had done was sort of created an Italian grandfather in the vacuum of my ignorance about who he had been. And so that's how that story within the story came about. And really, it became the beating heart of the entire novel.
In Christine's book on the history of Norwich State Hospital, she tells the story of how the hospital evolved over time to become one of the best psychiatric hospitals in the whole country. In 1890, a study recommended that a new state hospital be built due to the severe overcrowding at Connecticut Valley Hospital. However, it took 13 years to get legislative approval.
As CBH was so incredibly overcrowded, they were housing patients up in the attics and even in the stairwells leading up to the attics, because they had no place for anybody. So it was hot, it was humid. And I'm thinking patients were up here, they would die from, heat exhaustion and things like that. So that kind of like really drove home what overcrowding in a state-run facility would really be like back in that time period. So in researching and learning about why it seemed like the state of Connecticut was in such opposition to wanting to erect another state hospital here in Connecticut, it kind of just made me like, why would you constantly say no to this? And we know it's about money, that they didn't want to dole out the funds to establish another institution somewhere. It's like they seemed like they were in denial. Okay, we could just put everybody at CBH. We'll keep everybody at CBH. We can modify buildings. We'll put the money into CBH to try to make this work. But the state of Connecticut really, starting in 1890, wanted nothing to do with establishing another state hospital somewhere else in the state. But yes, this went on, from 1890, 1895, the matter was brought up again, 1897, 1899, 1901, repeatedly, the answer is, no, we're not going to build another state hospital. We're going to try to make it work at CBH. Finally, 1903, they realized, this isn't going to work at CBH. We do need to establish another state hospital elsewhere in the state.
In 2023, a well-researched book titled Secrets of the Asylum, Norwich State Hospital and My Family was published. Written by Julianne Mangin, a retired librarian from the Library of Congress, the book explores her family's history as it relates to the hospital. Julianne shared some insights into the causes of overcrowding.
People with ailments that were that had a neurological characteristic to it that weren't curable and weren't technically mentally ill. I think what happened was that at the time the hospital opened, they wanted to empty out places like the almshouses and the jails, which had been the dumping ground for like the poor, mentally ill. State hospitals in general seem to be a solution for a lot of things that they weren't really intended for. They were really just intended for the insane poor.
The legislature finally approved the construction of Norwich State Hospital for the insane in June of 1903. It opened the next year on October 10th. The problem of overcrowding, coupled with the lack of any effective treatments for mental illness at the time, led to the extreme treatments of the early 20th century.
If you look at something like lobotomy or the more extreme shock therapies, you lift them out of history and you just look at them today in light of today, our science and understanding, they seem absolutely barbaric and unthinkable. But you really have to look at it historically. You go back into the, back to the progressive era, the 1920s, 1930s, and state hospitals were really filling up and becoming more and more overcrowded, and states were very reluctant to raise taxes to pay for these institutions. And so they began to get more and more crowded, more and more understaffed, and they were looking for any way out, any way to lessen the patient load or make the lives of the staff there easier so they could retain, staff and doctors. And so the therapies became more and more extreme. And the goal was very specifically to empty out the hospitals. They thought if they could make somebody stop behaving in a certain way, they could send them home quietly with their family, or at least send them to a back ward where they wouldn't be as a problem, right? And so it comes out of a very specific historical moment. And obviously, in retrospect, we could see how problematic this is, but it wasn't generated from a place of barbarism or cruelty. It came from a scientific, therapeutic rationale in the face of overcrowding.
The most extreme treatment performed at Norwich was removal of teeth and other organs in an attempt to cure mental illness. This method was promoted by Dr. Henry Cotton, superintendent of the Trenton State Hospital in New Jersey. It eventually became one of the biggest medical scandals of the 20th century, and unfortunately had a devastating impact on thousands across the country, including Julianne's great-grandmother, Graziella.
He had been promoted by certain psychiatrists who were very, very well respected in the profession. And then when it was discovered that actually he had some problems in he had been faking his statistics to make this method of pulling teeth and organs and stuff out of people, making it look less harmful and more effective than it was. At that point, you would think that some of these higher up psychiatrists could have said something about it, but their reputations were on the line because they had already said what a wonderful doctor he was. And so they kind of kept that on the down low. And it's sad, but because of that attitude, that thousands of patients across the country probably were suffering. And then there were some people in the profession who wrote a report, and then the American Psychiatric Association refused to publish it because of, like I said, this reputation issue. And it's an example of when, they jumped into some of these methods, hopefully to cure mental illness, without really testing them. And so they had been writing notes every week when she was doing well, and suddenly there were no notes for over a month, and then we find out that she's thrown her false teeth down the toilet. Why wasn't that noted at the moment it happened? It's a significant event. It's almost like they pulled out all her teeth and she immediately became really, disturbed and unmanageable. And they might have thought, oh, we made a mistake. So they weren't going to put the evidence of it. But then when the family started writing and saying, we hear she's doing a lot worse, what's the deal? They had to own up to it, but they waited a long time. Graziella never got better after that. And she was kind of coming out of it at that point that they decided for some reason to pull out all our teeth.
During the Great Depression of the 1930s, the patient population continued to grow while resources became scarce. In 1939, a report on the conditions at Norwich Hospital was ordered by the Connecticut State Legislature. The report stated that the hospital stinks to high heaven. The resulting controversy over this report resulted in the resignation of the superintendent, Dr. Waterman. Although a follow-up report exonerated him, the Board of Trustees replaced him with Dr. William Bryan at the end of 1939.
He came into Norwich kind of like a breath of fresh air, and he was the leader that the hospital needed after having, Dr. Waterman and Dr. Wilcox and, the other superintendents that, came after Dr. Pollock that really just couldn't, for whatever reason, get it together. And he instituted rules and had excellent leadership in saying, okay, this is what's going to become of the hospital. This is what you're going to do. This is the direction that we're going to go in. The guy was revolutionary. The hospital had its first newsletter called The Stylus, which was distributed not only hospital-wide, but community-wide. So everybody knew what was going on at the hospital. And I believe he also did this with the newsletter to kind of break down that, attitude and stigma towards, people afflicted with mental illnesses, to show that we are a hospital that is doing good. We're here to try to cure. We're here to try to help. We're not a dungeon. We're not locking people up. We're not doing, horrible, bad things, because that's what everybody always, even back then, was thinking, this is what's being done. I remember reading about him that if he would find people, not doing their jobs, abusing patients, things like that, he did not hesitate to let somebody go on the spot. And that people were, quoted as saying that they could feel his presence hospital-wide, even if he was not on the ground. So he was just such a prominent, strong leader.
With the advent of World War II, the biggest problem Dr. Bryan faced was a critical staffing shortage that affected hospitals across the country. While Norwich did use conscientious objectors, Dr. Bryan came up with another solution to the problem.
One of the two options that Dr. Bryan took to overcome the staffing problem that occurred when the U.S. joined World War II was to place conscientious objectors there. But the big solution, the major solution he made, was deciding to take high-functioning mentally ill patients and giving them attendant jobs. And my grandmother, who was clearly extremely disturbed and hallucinating and had delusions and all, but she kind of calmed down in the hospital because she was separated from the situations that were abusive to her. She actually settled down, and she participated in, there was a radio station at the hospital, and she sang on the radio, and she performed in plays, and they decided she was a good candidate to train to be an attendant. But I thought it was really great that she got that opportunity, because it ended up giving her a place to live after she was discharged.
One of Norwich Hospital's most famous employees was a man named Jimmy John, shown here with head of maintenance John Avery. In Brewster's Neck, Jimmy tells the story of how he came to work at the hospital.
Well, this is how I got to be down at State Hospital. I always had bleeding ulcers. I could never get in the service. So I started to hang around a hub restroom, which is a dive, because I was so ashamed that everybody used to look at me and say, look, this guy's a draft dodger. So anyway, one day I'm drinking and getting drunk every day and the night, and so does. One day I'm sitting on the steps and three guys come over. Says, come on, Jim, take a ride with us. Well, I didn't know. I got in the car because I used to ride with a lot of these guys, and went down to the State Hospital. And John Clark was the businessman, and he says to me, I heard you're nothing but a bum. He said, I got a job for you. I said, I don't want no goddamn job. He said, well, I got a job in the garage. Take it for one day and quit. He said, at least I'm off your job. So anyway, I went down. Those days they had the conscientious objectors, and they were dancing in the kitchen, and I mean, when they went to lunch, and I kind of liked it. And then I ended up working after over 40 years, and it was all because I was ashamed people were going to call me a draft dodger, and always had a habit of dressing up. So when these guys come, and I was sitting there, I had a necktie and all that, and when they brought me down to the hospital, the first day I went to work in the garage, they threw a coverall which says, Norwich State Hospital. They dropped the state after I would. That guy says, you gotta wear it. I said, you gotta be out of your goddamn mind. No, you gotta. I said, I ain't gonna wear no goddamn thing. And they were walking out of the city. So I was always dressed up with a necktie. It was a habit. And then they give me there wasn't actually a study job, but every time the superintendent wanted to go, they'd call me. Then when I got out of the garage, I went to the grounds, and I always wore a necktie. And even when I was working, even the patients would stop me and say, are you a patient or are you a doctor? I said, why? He said, you look funny. You're driving a tractor, digging ditches, you got a necktie. And I got them. And it was just a habit.
After World War II, resources were finally available to the hospital, and it became the shining city on the Thames as described by local historian Bill Stanley. Sadly, Dr. Bryan died suddenly in 1944. His successor, Dr. Guthrie, resigned in 1948 following the tragic house fire that claimed the lives of his wife and a Norwich Hospital firefighter. Dr. Ronald Kettle then took over as superintendent.
Yeah, when Dr. Guthrie resigned 3 months after the fire, Dr. Kettle took over, and he was just pivotal in modernizing Norwich State Hospital, putting up, the Lodge building, the Kettle building, closing the, one by one, closing the older buildings. That was also around the time that White was demolished. And I guess there was like a little ceremony, closing the door on White because that building was notorious for just being a hellhole for the patients. Dr. Kettle's administration, the name changed from Norwich State Hospital to Norwich Hospital to eliminate that little, negative connotation that comes along with calling it a state hospital. But the biggest thing under Dr. Kettle's tenure was when the Russell Occupational Therapy Building was erected. That was a huge thing for Norwich Hospital because they did not want to just put up any old building for an occupational therapy center. Dr. Kettle and his team toured the United States, consulted with architects and other folks, and designed, the occupational therapy building was designed, this big, huge, beautiful 2-floor building, with a full basement for activities and such. So everything to benefit the patients was all in one building. And it was the first building on a state hospital campus to house everything in a brand new, modern, state-of-the-art building. The OT building had things like photography, a paint shop, weaving. They made and repaired mattresses right there on the campus. They had fine arts, ceramics. On the second floor of the OT building, there was a gorgeous wall, displaying all the patients' artwork. And, in the 50s, too, these things were also sold, in the community to, boost the patient's morale, their self-image, and their self-worth, and to make them feel good about themselves. And again, to continue to try to dissipate that barrier between, the community and a negative view of the state hospital.
There was also plenty of opportunity for outside recreation. Fishing and swimming at the reservoir was a favorite activity for the patients. One of the biggest advocates for physical fitness was Dr. Christian van Velde. He was the head of research in the newly created Ribbikoff building. In this interview from Brewster's Neck, Dr. van Velde talked about the exercise program at the hospital and the film made about it that was shown around the world.
Because these many patients were sitting doing nothing, I started with gym climbs with schizophrenic patients. That resulted in very impressive changes in the patients, not that their symptoms were cured, but their interactions with other patients. Also, there was music and they danced to it. They had something different to do than sitting and rocking right through the world. We made a movie of that. That movie traveled all over the world. Schizophrenia, the title of the movie was Mens sana in corpore sano, which is Latin for a sound mind in a sound body. So we had requests from Moscow, Tokyo, South America, since the movie I made that year. It is quite a change in these slugging schizophrenics into them dancing around and smiling. And the nursing staff were always very happy if they saw their patients getting better.
In 1955, the hospital was at its peak census with over 3,000 patients. However, with deinstitutionalization in the 1960s, every year that number steadily declined. When Christine gave a talk about her first book, a former employee mentioned that the title, More Patients, Less Patients, was the same as the title of a nursing handbook given to employees in the 1960s when they went through nursing education. It was in the 1960s when I first went to Norwich Hospital. Mom was a nurse, and she took my brother and I and my sisters to trick-or-treat in the Lippitt building for Halloween. It was in 1965 that Dr. Kettle retired and Dr. Morgan Martin became superintendent. In the 60s and into the 1970s, all the nurses and the psychiatric aides wore white. By the time I started working at the hospital in 1981, the dress code had been relaxed and the regular street clothes could be worn. The downside to that was in the event that there was a riot on a ward and a code 999 was called, which summoned all staff. If staff arrived at an unfamiliar ward, they might not know the patient from the staff member. A few months after I started working, I was able to get a room at the employee's home, the same building where I was interviewed by Destination Fear. I had a corner room that overlooked the front. A few years later, I met my wife to be Sherry. We've been together now for 38 years. It was around 1985 when Garrel Mullaney became superintendent. In Brewster's Neck, Mr. Mullaney spoke about the events leading up to the closure.
When the governors changed, frankly, with Governor Weicker, we were developing what we'll call caring communities, and we had a heck of a plan in Norwich. Then the governors changed. Frankly, it was a shock when in the governor's inaugural address in February, when he announced that Fairfield and Norwich would close. I really, up until that day, when I was told that I should watch what was going to happen, I didn't have an inkling that we would close that quickly, that our plan for this caring community would not go any farther.
And so Norwich Hospital closed its doors for the last time. Now, I know that people will still think haunted asylum when they hear Norwich Hospital, but we know the truth. It was a psychiatric hospital, and it was one of the best.
Norwich Hospital. Oh, I'm sorry, the hospital is closed.